So, welcome back. I hope you had a wonderful time resting, napping, taking a short contemplative walk. Whatever it was you did, I hope you feel a little bit more rejuvenated. So, we're heading into the last session, which is about work. How do we reimagine work? How do we reimagine our work in the world, and what is work? What does work mean to us? Those are the questions I want you to be thinking about as I lay the foundation. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation if we don't first look at the economy that our work is plugged into, because this is a critical piece of thinking about our work in the world. The economies that we all feed, that we all profit from, that we all are a part of. So there is often we think of the free market economy, the capitalist economy, and we think of socialism, communism. There's different social democracies. There's different kind of economies, right? And in this country, I've heard it said that we have a hybrid. We have a free market, but we also have certain forms of democratic socialism. So imagine if you go out to buy a car, and you buy your new GM Chrysler, and you get in, that is something that is a capitalist, a free market enterprise. You get to go and choose from many, many different cars, and then you drive it off the lot, and that is what they would call socialism on that road that you drive home, because your tax dollars are used for the common purpose of providing us with a place, all safe and good roads. Maybe not so good in some places, but you get the picture. Another thing is our health care. You know, as we're worker bees throughout our lives, we're contributing, we're getting some sort of health care from our employer, usually, or buying it on the market, the free market. It's a competitive enterprise, many different choices, or you're offered one through your employer. But when you are paying into a system that when you hit retirement age or 65, you get Medicare. And Medicare is a socialist form that we find in many countries, especially Western industrial countries like Canada, where everybody gets covered no matter what, whether you have a pre-existing condition or not, you all get to be a part of Medicare. So we have different forms of economies that we're a part of. But I want to offer a third way, which is God's Sabbath economy, that we often don't get to think about. What is the economy that God's dream for us was, perhaps way back in the biblical times as the Israelites were forging their path in the world? What was God's Sabbath economy? It's the third way, as Anabaptists like to talk about. It's not this or this, but it's a third option. And we like to talk about this often when we think about situations that might involve violence or something destructive. Instead of hitting back or taking flight or leaving, running, fight or flight, there's a third way, which is to turn around and engage in something that is alternative, a different way of seeing and being. And so the third way from my tradition, the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, is that as a historic peace church, we choose to engage in nonviolent, peaceful resistance instead of running away or fighting back. So I like to think of this particular God's Sabbath economy, this particular economy, as the third way. So I'm going to heavily use this particular book. Here's a little advertisement or commercial break. You can see that I have all my little notes here. But this has been a real foundational book that is wonderful. It's real skinny, wonderful for small groups or churches trying to explore new ways of thinking about Sabbath and God's Sabbath economy. Sabbath as Resistance, Saying No to the Culture of Now. Walter Brueggemann was an Old Testament scholar, and he's retired now, but a brilliant scholar who really looks at the biblical injunctive to keep Sabbath, and why don't we keep Sabbath after all? He begins his book by saying, for the most part, contemporary Christians pay little attention to the Sabbath. Contemporary Christians pay little attention to the Sabbath. He thinks that it's the least kept commandment of all. Why is that? Well, he supposes that it might be because of many Christians grew up with the blue laws, which my parents and grandparents and many of you did, which means all the shops, all the businesses were shut down on Sunday, so there was no place to go. You had to stay at home and sit on a bench and pray. Well, not really. But the idea was people who grew up during the blue laws, which felt restricted and like a legalistic thing that you couldn't enjoy yourself, the leisure of shopping, that it became a requirement that left a bad taste in people's mouth. So Brueggemann says all these thou shalt nots, this context did not offer much potential for seeing the Sabbath in a positive way as an affirmative declaration of faith or identity. So unfortunately, we lost the idea of a 24-hour Sabbath. You might go to worship on Sunday morning, but do you then go home and unplug all your techno toys, not use the dishwasher, the washing machine? What is Sabbath for you? And what does God's Sabbath call us to? So God's Sabbath began, as we know, the historical context was the people of Israel who were living in Egypt under the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh was an exploitive, what is called an anxiety system. This is what Brueggemann says. The fourth commandment, which it eventually became a commandment, right? The fourth commandment, observe the Sabbath to keep it holy. The fourth commandment, he says, is the most difficult and most urgent to keep in our society because it summons us to intent and conduct that defies the most elemental requirements of a commodity-propelled society that specializes in control, entertainment, bread, and circuses, along with anxiety and violence. He talks about Pharaoh's anxiety system manifested as the Pharaoh's insatiable script for production. So this is what the people of Israel were trapped in. God had become the economic engine. This was God. Jobs, the economic engine. Make sure it keeps going at any cost. And so the people were trapped as slaves for 400 years, it says in the Bible. They did not know that they were not free. They had the flesh pots, which they pined for when they finally left Egypt. The flesh pots were literally pots full of meat that they could get while living in this system. So that was one of the little perks. If they could get their little piece of the pie to make them feel safe and secure, then they could be happy. So they had a place to sleep. They had a place to live. It was hard even for the Israelites to imagine themselves leaving this insatiable machine that they were part of, building the Pharaoh's granaries and buildings and acquiring land and people, human labor and resources, all for the Pharaoh's wealth. But then Moses met the burning bush. Remember that story? I love that story. Moses sees that burning bush in the middle of, while he's tending sheep. And God says, take off your shoes, you are on holy ground. And then begins to invite him into this bigger dream that God has for his people and wants Moses to lead them out of the land of Egypt. So off into the wilderness they go. And the first lesson they learn is about Sabbath keeping, right? They were not to gather more manna each day. They were supposed to just trust God for their daily bread. But when it came to Sabbath, the seventh day, they were supposed to gather enough the day before and and keep it, it would not go bad for the Sabbath. So this became the rhythm, that just as the God of creation had shown them that they must rest on the seventh day, they did that also, which, as we know, is sundown on Friday night for the Jewish community until Saturday night. So we have Shabbat, we have Sabbath, that the Hebrews in the wilderness began to understand that what needed to happen was that they shed this kind of oppressive mindset of being plugged into an economy, this market-driven economy that was not in their best interest. It was not about people. So Walter Brueggemann lays out God's Sabbath economy. What is Sabbath economy, after all? Walter Brueggemann says it's people over profits. It's relationship first. Now, when we think about God's Sabbath economy, God first wants to be in relationship with us. Brueggemann writes that this God is subsequently revealed as a God of mercy, a God of steadfast love, a God of faithfulness who is committed to covenantal relationships of fidelity. The Sabbath rest of God is the acknowledgement that God and God's people in the world are not commodities to be dispatched for endless production, and so dispatched, as we would used to say, as hands in the service of the command economy. Rather, they are subjects situated in an economy of neighborliness. And all of this is implicit in this idea of divine rest, that you stop and cease work, which is really what the Hebrew word means, Shabbat. Cease your labor and be neighborly, be in community, be in relationship with one another, with your own soul, and most of all with the God of creation. So that's the first most important principle of this Sabbath, God's Sabbath economy, is that people are more important than profit and commodities, and even that we have jobs. Often people have jobs that are not don't make them feel valuable. Jobs that are difficult, that people feel like a cog in the machine. And we have not, as Christians, as Christian community, been good at creating alternative economies for not even our people and our congregations, as well as the communities around us, to participate in. What would that look like is a good question for communities. If you would really take this seriously, what would that look like? So one of the things to begin thinking about as you think about God's Sabbath economy is that you are God's peculiar people. You are different than the economy around you. You are called to be, as the Jewish people were called to be throughout the ages, a mindful people, a people who are conscious of not only systems of oppression, but conscious of your behavior in those systems and how you live your life differently. Michael Fishbane has done a lot of writing also on the Jewish Sabbath and this Jewish mindfulness, and he talks about a distinct faith identity in the midst of a culture that is inhospitable to all distinct identities in its impatient reduction of all human life to the requirements of the market. So Sabbath, on the other hand, sanctifies human relationship as well as time. And we have this beautiful classic book called The Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel. Abraham Joshua Heschel is a rabbi who lays out for the Jewish people this brilliant plan that God had to create them in God's image. And every time you keep Sabbath, you remember who you are and who God is and who you are called to be as God's people. So in sanctifying time, on this day, certain workaday activities and ordinary busyness are suspended and brought to a halt. In their stead, this is Michael Fishbane, Fishbane, sorry. In their stead, a whole host of ways of resting the body and mind are cultivated. And that's what you're going to be doing after my little talk here, my hour talk, is you're going to be cultivating this way of resting your body and mind through art, through yoga, through food, through children's activities, play, through a walk, a nature walk, many different ways that you can think about how you rest in your body and soul and unplug from this economy, this notion that you need to be ceaselessly working all the time. On the Sabbath, the practical benefits of technology are laid aside, and one tries to stand in the cycle of natural time without manipulation or interference. This is a very important point, is unplugging from our technology. I think that is the single most important thing that we are struggling to take a Sabbath from these days, right? Is our techno toys, our ability to be plugged into the World Wide Web and distract our minds, keep us from a deeper focus and a deeper concentration, which is what Sabbath calls us to. Is, again, Michael Fishbane. Slowly, under these multiple conditions, a sense of inaction takes over. And the day does not merely mark the stoppage of work or celebrate the completion of a project or creation, but it enforces the value that the earth is a gift of divine creativity. The earth is a gift of divine creativity. God is giving us the gift of this creation as a sacred trust. And when we stop our work and unplug from this economy in all ways, we are participating in God's Sabbath economy, where we are understanding that creation is a sacred trust, and we are part of that, of building that sacred trust, of honoring that sacred trust. So Sabbath becomes a time of stasis. But you will not hear these messages of God's Sabbath economy, trusting more and more in God, that if you stop, God can continue the work even without you. The theologian Barbara Brown Taylor sees Sabbath-keeping as active resistance to the exploitation of others and the exhaustion of the land. Quote, and this is from my book, Soul Tending, page 99, "When you stop working, so do your children, your animals, your employees. By interrupting our economically sanctioned social order every week, Sabbath suspends our subtle and not so subtle ways of dominating one another and the earth on a regular basis." Unquote. She goes on to lament that where there is money to be made, there is no rest for the land or those who live on it. Resistance will have to come from those who live by a different rhythm. That's what we are called to do as the people of God, live by a different rhythm, and that is God's Sabbath. That is at the heart of God's Sabbath economy. And you can see how hard it was for the people of God out in the wilderness. The people of Israel struggled mightily with not only Sabbath keeping, always trying to collect more and more and more, and we saw that it would rot. Manna would literally rot. And they could only get quails, day by day by day. So God's Sabbath economy allows us Sabbath keeping so we can begin to become awake and aware to how our model of an economy and work, our labor, destroys people's lives and the gifts of the earth, and work's true purpose and living life-giving outcome is lost when that happens. God's Sabbath economy is about deconcentrating power and wealth at the top. This is a key thing. It's about deconcentrating power and wealth at the top. So when the people left Israel, or the people of Israel left Egypt land, they were liberated from the steroid demands of the workplace. Their hearts were unbound, their minds were decolonized, and their habits were retrained. God was making them anew in the wilderness. This is also in the very last chapter, Reimagining Work, page 100. God was retraining their minds. That's what Sabbath can do, is retraining our minds and helping us together as communities. If communities really studied and spent time with this idea of Sabbath, perhaps we could come up with creative new ideas, models, alternative models to offer to the communities around the world around, in how all God's family deserves a rest. Even the welfare mom, even the mom who works 2 jobs for her children, even the immigrant who works 15-hour shifts so that he can provide us with food. So Sabbath-keeping, God's Sabbath economy, was a sea change that contrasted with the economic narratives of biblical greed, endless exploitation, and he calls it the disease of greed, the dis-ease of greed, and the beginning of biblical justice meant to bring relief for those who are weary and burdened by the economic engine that ate people up and spit them out. And just a quick note on what that Sabbath, God's Sabbath economy, the blueprint for that. So we all know in Leviticus, that's where it's kind of laid out. We have the Sabbath commandment, the 10 commandments, the 4th commandment, and we have then the Levitical model, the map, the blueprint that was laid out over time, where you have every 7 days, obviously, people rested. It was Saturday. For Christians, it's Sunday. And then every 7th year, the people were called to take a year off, sabbatical, if you will. And what does that mean? How can we do that as normal, everyday people? It seems like only tenured people get it, academics, pastor types. What would it look like if communities allowed you to take even a month off after 7 years to financially support that as you are exploring new parts of your life and new ways of being? So every 7th year in the biblical model, people were called to let their land lie fallow. They were supposed to have stored up enough so the land could lie fallow for a year. Let your servants rest, let your animals rest. This was absolutely radical to the economic engine at that time in the Near East, the ancient Near East. People have often said, the people never kept that in the Bible. They didn't do that. But actually there is cause to believe, and it was from Josephus, the historian, who noted that the people did indeed keep a 7th year sabbatical or Sabbath. Maybe not for long, because it made them look very weird and peculiar, and they were always being persecuted. But they tried, at least. And then finally, 7 times 7, which is the 50th year, and we've heard of the Jubilee year. We've heard of the Jubilee movement in our culture to release debt from developing countries who are burdened by the debt from the International Monetary Fund. That is a 50th year Jubilee concept of Sabbath, that you release debt from people who owe you money or owe you something. You return people's ancestral land to them, because in that time, as is now, land was what was worth something valuable. And your ancestral land's torn from you, whether you're Palestinian or whether you're indigenous people in this country. Land is your power, is your life blood. So you return it to to the people you have taken it from, and you free your slaves, you free your servants. They no longer have to work for you. You start over. You reset the system. So these are all really important concepts, and one of the things you can do daily to begin to prepare yourself for a 7th-day Sabbath, to rest on the 7th day, is to take mini Sabbaths every day. Sit for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, or take a prayerful walk around your neighborhood and begin to turn your eyes towards the Lord of the Sabbath, towards God, who is drawing you home and asking you to reimagine your life, even in this culture we live in. But the power of a new Sabbath is really a new vision for Sabbath really must come from communities, I believe. And Ched Myers, another little commercial break, Ched Myers, who is a biblical scholar and a teacher, author, has written these fabulous books, Sabbath Economics, the biblical vision of Sabbath economics. Ched Myers, this one is by Matthew Colwell. But these are wonderful also things for communities to study together, to think about how do we move towards a new way of thinking about our lives together. We might not be able to completely unplug from the big economic engine we're all plugged into, but we can begin to reimagine new ways of offering financial freedom or security in our congregations by perhaps think about building a Jubilee Fund. A Jubilee Fund for people who come from the community who need money, or a Jubilee Fund for people within who are suffering under the burden of debt or the weight of working multiple jobs, which is not what God intended. God intended us to be, as I said earlier, human beings, not human doings, and that's what God's Sabbath and God's Sabbath economy can call us to over time. One really interesting thing that I want to bring out about the biblical text of the Ten Commandments, this is something that Patrick Miller, a theologian, has laid out, is that when you look at where, the fourth commandment sets up in the Ten Commandments, it's after the first three commandments. What are the first three commandments? You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an image in the form of anything other than God. You shall not make any graven images. And finally, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. These are all commandments about honoring God, our relationship with God, respecting and honoring and building a basic understanding of who God is. God wants all of our attention and ultimately our love and commitment and our fidelity as people. And that's what these first three commands are about. And then we have observe the Sabbath to keep it holy. Observe this day. Don't just observe it, but keep it. And then the last six commandments are about your neighbor, right? They're about how we treat our neighbor. Thou shalt not, you shall not commit adultery. You shall honor your mother and father. You shall not lie. You shall not steal. All of these things have to do with how you treat your neighbor. And so we remember the great commandment that Jesus talked about. He takes this commandment and distills it and says, love the Lord your God, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the great commandment. And everything right there in that nutshell. So Sabbath is the bridge, the hinge, if you will, between our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves when we stop working on Sabbath, and our relationship with our neighbor. How can we have a balanced life if we don't keep Sabbath? Because it is the hinge between God and our neighbor and ourselves. So these are all concepts, a foundation for understanding God's Sabbath economy, the vision of biblical justice, and how we in this day and age can begin to, as we're in this pandemic portal, we don't know what's going to be like on the other side. We don't know what kind of economy is going to get up and running after we come through this portal. Right now, we're looking at almost depression level loss of job and income and economic suffering. It's a time when we can imagine new ideas and new ways of being, and put some of those in place in our communities. Ultimately, as we are going to need to figure out how to localize our economies more and more, which I know you are already doing there, as you have bellwether farms, you have food that is growing, you have food that you share with one another. How do we create local systems of bartering, of sharing, of gifting one another, so that we can begin to have local ways to live together and honoring that? Wendell Berry really spends a lot of time on how we honor our local communities, how rural communities, by and large, and small-scale farms have been so, they've just been gutted, basically, by our economic policies. And that is not the biblical justice model of God's Sabbath economy. So I want to just leave you before you go and explore some of those wonderful experiences of Sabbath. I want to read you from this. It's a Wendell Berry poetry book. And he writes about our work. Whatever is foreseen in joy must be lived out from day to day. Vision held open in the dark by our 10,000 days of work. Harvest will fill the barn, and for that the hand must ache, the face must sweat. But yet no leaf or grain is filled by the work of ours. The field is tilled and left to grace, that we may reap. Great work is done while we're asleep. When we work well, a Sabbath mood rests on our days and finds it good. So, go out and enjoy your Sabbath and begin to reimagine what work could look like in the world, because when we come back, we will talk about reimagining our own work in the world and what is labor for? What is it about? And how can we think about our workaday world differently? Thanks for joining me.